right, welcome to the very last professional development opportunity of the 2022-23 school year. We're very excited to have newly tenured and promoted Associate Professor Dr. Andrew Allen here to teach us about woodwinds.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. So I've got my spiel, but at any point along the line, if y'all want to ask questions about anything, this is, your expertise and your questions about this. If you have a question about something, as I always like to say, probably somebody else does too. So if y'all have any questions before I get rolling, if you've got questions kind of at breathing points, please by all means ask. So before we get started, do y'all have any big questions about woodwinds that you're like, okay, I don't think he'll probably cover this, but let's go ahead and ask? Okay. If anything pops up along the way, just say the word. I'm going to kind of more or less go in score order today. We're going to talk about flute, then clarinet, then saxophone, and as time allows, oboe and bassoon. We love those instruments, but just numbers wise, you're going to encounter a lot more flutists, clarinets, and saxophonists in your life. So this is a conversation partly that Dr. HD and I were just having, but a lot of old clinics used to say, who should play these instruments? And you guys may have heard about the very understandable blow up at Texas MEA a few years ago when somebody basically implied that to play bassoon, a kid needed to be rich. Um, I don't play that. No. And none of you do either, I know. So, I will mention just a couple things to keep in mind potentially when kids want to play certain instruments. None of this is a deal breaker. What is the most, reliable factor of a student's success on an instrument? Their desire to play it, right? So if a kid is drawn to the instrument, anything can be adapted. Anything can be worked around if you're thinking about it the right way. So, flute. Who should play flute? Anybody that wants to play flute, right? And this is one of those instruments where we always have to make sure that we aren't playing into gender stereotypes because who can play flute? Anybody can play flute. Now, something you'll hear in woodwind textbooks is that you need to look at the embouchures of potential flute players. You need to look at their mouths. A lot of people say that if you have the Cupid's bow, if you guys know what I'm talking about. So let's see if I can probably can't get close enough. I've got one, but it's the little knob, that little piece of hanging down flesh in the middle of your upper lip. Sometimes you'll run into sources that say, okay, they have the Cupid's bow, they shouldn't play flute. I don't think that's true at all. My wife is a wonderful music educator and flutist. She doesn't have it, but there has been this picture of flute embouchures of some of the great flutists the last 100 years rolling through flute social media, and about half of them had the Cupid's bow. So, generally speaking, all that's going to mean is that if a student has the little hanging down piece of material on their upper lip, they're probably just going to play off center. And that's not bad. It's just something you need to be aware of. They can be just as successful. The other thing to think about, especially with younger players, if y'all start fourth graders on flute, sometimes the reach can be a little much. Yeah, so we'll talk about equipment in a minute, but flutes, even at the beginner level, probably have more bells and whistles, more potential um, doodads and add-ons than any other instrument, just because it's relatively simple to manufacture, so it doesn't really require that much effort to change some things. There's an option called an inline G, which just means in your left hand, all of the keys would more or less be straight across like they are in the right hand. I have no idea why on earth that exists. Because if you guys imagine that, okay, you got the plateau going, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and you're trying to reach even farther across in your third finger, that's not going to be comfortable for anybody. So stay away from that kind of thing like the plague. They do make adaptive head joints for small students, curved head joints for the standard C flute that make it much easier to play for very young students. Jupiter and several other manufacturers even have C flutes without the foot joint for very young and small flutists. There's been a movement called Kinder Flute in the last 20 years that has wonderful pedagogical materials for quite young students. And they made a lot of strides in adapting the instrument to students as young as 5 or 6. There are also easily accessible extensions that you can buy to bring keys a little bit more in line for small hands. So if you ever run into a student who's really spreading fingers and having a hard time with stability, just look around for those. Ask me. I'll track them down for you, and we can find them. But flute, lots of good options for accessibility and for changing the instrument to suit the needs of the student. So let's talk about embouchure a little bit on flute. This is something, flute tone development is one of the harder things for beginning students. You know, brass players, single reed players, they're probably going to get a sound, and they're probably going to get a big sound a lot quicker than your flute players. This is a little bit of a weird mechanism. So one thing that I would counsel you to avoid when you're talking to students, try your best not to compare it to a Coke bottle. It really is a different enough approach that they're gonna learn some bad habits if they do that. So if we're blowing across the top of a Coke bottle, I don't have a Coke bottle, but I got my water flask. What are we gonna do? We're gonna purse our lips, right? And of course, I'm not getting any sound on my water flask, but a lot of embouchure is involved. A lot of muscles are involved to bring all that material in. We do that on flute. What's going to happen? Nothing. We're going to blow and blow and blow, and the kid's going to pass out in the chair, and you're going to get that, right? And you may have seen that before. So I would stay away from that analogy entirely. It's not the same physics that are at play. Um, the way the flute actually works is the opposite side of the head joint, it's a little sharp cutting edge. And essentially, this is a permanent reed. What this is doing, it's splitting the airstream in two. The airstream should be aimed at this opposite edge. It's splitting the airstream in two. The disturbance caused by the actual splitting of the airstream creates the vibrations in the air column within the instrument, which creates sound. And then you're just putting keys down to adjust the length of the tube, which creates the difference in pitch. So, first of all, you need to make sure that the head joint, when it's on the instrument, is adjusted in a way so that when the student is holding the instrument, that stream of air is going to be aimed at the cutting edge. So it needs to be angled in a little bit towards the student. Now, I'm going to advocate this on just about all the woodwinds, I think, to begin with, and really for a long period of development afterwards. It's good to spend a lot of time on the shortest part of the instrument. Mouthpiece and barrel for clarinet, mouthpiece for saxophone, and head joint for flute. So you notice I said this wasn't the proper embouchure for flute. It shouldn't be puckered. It shouldn't be in. The flute embouchure is almost a non-embouchure. What I usually like to say to students in my woodwind tech class is you start with a bored face. So just like you are very bored and you're sitting there. Now, hopefully none of you are bored. Hopefully none of your flute students are going to be bored. But that very relaxed, almost straight across lips kind of thing is where we start. Everything's relaxed. All the muscles up here are relaxed. Now you're going to take that same bored face and you're going to smush it into the lip plate. And you're still very bored. And the actual embouchure for flute, you don't form it. You don't form the opening before you start playing. Your air is the thing that's going to form the aperture, the hole in the embouchure, right? You're just going to go. Have your students think poo, poo, poo. Well, maybe not poo, because if you're dealing with middle school kids, it's going to cost you 10 minutes of class. But some people say spitting out pumpkin seeds, spitting out sunflower seed shells, anything that gets you to that little separating of the lips with the airstream and then a solid airstream thereafter. The weight of the upper lip is what actually controls the airstream. It's going to meter that air a little bit, just the weight of the face itself. It needs to be as relaxed as possible as you go. Now, you guys may not be able to see this just because my office is the 30s and the light isn't great, but you guys are probably going to see, if you can see, I'm not playing in the center of my face. If a kid doesn't have this Cupid's bow, it'll be pretty much squared up in the center. But again, if somebody plays off to one side or the other, again, my wife is a wonderful flutist. She doesn't have the Cupid's bow. She still plays very slightly off to one side. It's just going to be whatever's comfortable and how the muscles are developed in an individual's face. I'll say this several times through the course of today. You will see pictures in books that illustrate things, and that's great. Those are for reference purposes. Remember that every person, their face structure, their musculature, their jaw bones, the size of everything is very different. And there isn't one way that everybody's going to look when they're playing. I want you to think more about general guidelines and more about what's healthy. What is the I don't want to say the path of least resistance because that's usually not the right approach. But what's the path where everything is free, everything is going to be healthy across the long term? That's the way that I want you to think. Anyway, so you can do a lot of preliminary work on the head joint. You can work on tone development. You can work on embouchure. You can work on initial articulation, which let's talk about that for a minute. You're going to hear me say a bunch of times, don't use ta today for the other woodwinds. And I'll tell you why in a little bit. But on flute, you can absolutely use the syllable ta. Ta, 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 ta. Now you notice I'm not saying ta, 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 ta. If you demonstrate that way, what's going to happen? Right? Your kids aren't going to articulate with their tongues, they're going to articulate with their airstream. And I would say that's probably not what you want most of the time. In fact, I would say almost all articulations on any of these woodwinds, except for the most extreme of jazz articulations, where you really want a complete and utter separation, that you really need to have your airstream flowing and your tongue does the work of a valve, releasing and allowing air to flow, having contact, and allowing air to stop for a moment while still keeping the lungs moving. Anyway, so ta on flute, what's going on? Ta, ta, ta. My tongue is hitting the point right where my hard palate and my gums meet, like right at the base of your teeth almost. Ta, 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 ta. And that's just obstructing the airway enough where that air can't get by when we're doing it. One thing that you're going to find maybe with some of your beginning students, you may experience if you hear like a spitty sound and like a really, really sharp cease in the sound, something that's on flute, it starts to sound really inconsistent. This is what it might sound like on the flute itself. Yeah, gotta adjust my hip joint the right way. If they keep bouncing up and down accidentally between octaves, that's a really good sign that they're probably articulating between their lips, that the tongue is actually going right into the aperture. You're going to have accuracy problems with that. There's going to be problems. So kind of police that, make sure they're touching inside, ta, 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 ta. And one of the best approaches to that is actually have them say the syllable, just like I just did with a complete airstream underneath it and go back and forth, back and forth. Again, this is going to be one of those things. They're all probably hitting in a slightly different place. You don't want to really probably tell them exactly where it should be hitting because some could be hitting on teeth a little above where I said. Just make sure they're not going in between. And if you ever hear a g, 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 something like that that's got this little undertone and is really kind of shallow and weird, they're probably not hitting the tongue. That's far less of a problem on flute than on the single reeds. We'll talk about that more later. Anyway, so I do have a handout that I'm going to send you later, so I'm going to consult my handout to figure out what else I need to tell you about. Oh, yeah, I need to talk about posture. So you'll see a lot of students, especially high school students, especially who are coming off of the first year of marching band, sitting very, very, very straight and very proper. And they may be doing this and they may have their right arm completely squared off. Now, you guys can probably already see in this video, you can see that band of muscles really distinctly. Now, I am somebody who's trained my whole life to play saxophone, not so much flute. And I've spent a lot of time making sure that I'm using these muscles efficiently. And even me, when I do this, everything starts to clamp up. You do not need to be militaristic with your flutes. Guess what? This is a perfectly acceptable flute angle, right? Now, this, not so much, but a slight angle down where the arms are comfortable, they're not overextended. That's perfectly acceptable angle for flute. So don't think that everybody has to be a martinet absolutely parallel to the ground. That's really not the way that these are supposed to be played. And even if any of you guys do marching band, take it easy on the kids because if they're overextending all the time for the sake of visuals, um, you're going to hurt them. Especially that right hand. I start doing that. I start locking that elbow to get that parallel, and I can't move my fingers. You're going to impact technique. You're going to impact overall well-being and general health moving forward. You could create repetitive motion injuries when there's tension in the hands. So it's really something to watch out for. Um, don't let them like, but let it be proper and comfortable, right? Anyway, cool. All right. Oh, something else about embouchure before I totally move on. A lot of people will go with the kiss and roll approach. If you do that, you're going to have a diffuse sound on flute. And I know that sounds like a nitpicky thing, but it really puts them in the wrong plane. So if I kiss and roll, I'm going to end up with a really airy sound because in actuality, that's putting the head joint about a half inch higher than it really needs to be. Head joint needs to be underneath your lower lip. And of course, I've been moving my head joint all around. Anyway, but it's just something else to keep in mind. Cool. Um, okay. Now, tuning. This is something else we should talk about. Um, tune to a concert B flat, tune to a concert A, great. It's going to be that low and first octave above B flat or A. But a lot of people will advocate rolling around on the head joint to adjust intonation up or down. You can get a little bit of that, right? The pitch will go up, the pitch will go down, but what happens really quickly is you lose the center of sound and it just doesn't sound good anymore. So when I talk about saxophone in a few minutes, I'll mention a concept called voicing that I would advocate to adjust intonation on all of the woodwinds. I think it's the most appropriate way. You can adjust intonation up and down without changing tone quality. I'm able to pull up and down way more than if I were messing with the head joint in action, and the tone stays much more consistent. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay. Now, something else you need to keep in mind is how on earth are your kids supposed to know what any of these instruments sound like? I mean, we've gone to music school. We've done this for a long time. But how is anybody else supposed to know what these things sound like, right? Now, luckily, we live in a day and age where there is a great pop star who happens to be a wonderful flutist. I mean, if kids have heard Lizzo's music, they're hearing a really darn good flute sound. But beyond that, you really don't encounter a lot of flutists out in the real world necessarily, besides some film soundtracks and some other things. So you need to put great examples in front of them. Now, I'll send you all that. Well, I'll probably email the handout to Dr. HD and she'll get it out to you guys. But you'll notice when you get the handout, I've got listening examples for each instrument. Now, the other important part of this too is I'm a strong believer in if you can't see it, it's a lot harder to be it. So I like to make sure that I get all kinds of great instrumentalists who look like all of our kids as much as I can do. Yes, Dr. HD.
Sorry, I was slow earlier. I wanted to back up to the rolling the head joint.
Yeah,
I teach that as an emergency, like if you're holding a note in a concert and you need to change it, then you can roll it for an
right,
emergency, but not for actually tuning.
right. Like
Is okay,
like
so
if
that's
if
okay.
if something's weird's going on, the voicing thing can actually work as quickly, in my opinion. But yeah, if there's something extreme, like if the kid accidentally tunes the wrong part of the horn, which can happen, right? They tune like a low F or something and don't tune the rest of the horn. Um, then that may be a situation where you need to do a little something extreme. But as long as they tune correctly, the voicing thing we'll talk about, I think, will change things.
All right, cool.
Anything that usually needs to be changed. But
And
before we move
thank you
on,
for bringing, I'm sorry, thank you for bringing Lizzo up as a great flute player because it is important that our students see themselves when they watch people who do what they want to do.
absolutely, and I mean she's a darn good flutist.
Yeah, she
Um,
is.
I don't know if you guys saw, she got to go to the Library of Congress has a flute vault, and she got to play James Madison's flute. And
Yeah, that started a whole controversy.
because people are insane. But what Elise and I were like amazed by. So she took this crystal flute. That those are really hard to play. So I mean that's more than 200-year-old flute that is not built to modern intonation standards. And she was sitting there playing that thing for 15 minutes and sounding wonderful, and her intonation was great. And there are a lot of professional like flute profs that wouldn't have been able to play as in tune with as glorious of a sound as she played on that instrument. She's a really fine musician. Anyway, all around, she's a really fine musician. We're Lizzo fans in our household. Anyway, um, so if I can share my screen, I had a couple good examples of just some potential flutists to get in front of your students. Yes, there's cool. Nope, nope. Did I just do it right? I did not do it right.
Try it. I just gave you privileges. Try it now, and if that doesn't work, send it to me and I'll share.
Awesome. So first of all, if you guys can hear this okay, um, this is one of my favorite chamber ensembles on earth, Imani Winds. If you guys have never heard of Imani Winds, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, these are some of the most glorious woodwind sounds that you're going to hear. They also have really engaging, really interesting performances. They are some of the greatest proponents of contemporary music for woodwind quintet, and they also do really accessible, fun recordings. Their concerts are amazing. But anyway, this is a little example of this. Let me know if this doesn't come across, and I can just send links in the chat.
I can't hear it.
Oh no. Okay. Tell you what, I'm gonna drop this in the chat, and we'll do it that way. Um, but okay, how do I get out of here?
Oops, thank you.
There we go. Stop sharing. There we go. Sorry. So let me do it this way instead. You would think this far into pandemic times, I would know how to use this stuff, but I am just a Luddite. Oh, there's the chat. Sorry, guys. So here's the Amani Wins video. And here are a couple really good examples that I think are really useful for kids. So this first flute example is a flutist named Emmanuel Pahoud. Pahoud's the principal flute of the Vienna Philharmonic, or sorry, Berlin Philharmonic, and also one of the great flute soloists of the world. And he just so happens to be a guy. Now, there are a lot of great flutists who are everybody, but oddly, this is one of the ones that you may need to use occasionally when you have a young man who really wants to play flute and you're getting weird pushback from the family saying, you just like this wonderful flutist. Instruments don't have genders, right? Anybody can play anything they want to. Another really, really great example is Claire Chase. And Claire Chase, if you got a kid who's into like interesting music, especially as they're getting into late middle school, early high school, likes metal, likes punk music, send them towards Claire Chase. Claire Chase is one of the most interesting artists, in my opinion, in the U.S. right now, period. For a long time, she was executive director of and artistic director of the International Contemporary Ensemble. And she's since left that organization to do more of her own solo playing and curating. But just look her up online. She has done some cool things. If a kid is like into like kind of out there rock music, they're really gonna like what Claire Chase is doing. Anyway, so what questions do y'all have about flute before I move past that for the moment? Well, it's clarinet time. Now, obviously, if anybody thinks of anything, oh yeah, Tori.
I guess from my understanding, because I'm very new, I'm more of a, like the orchestra choral personality. Um, Kind of like how I approach things is like don't let the physicality get in the way of the student wanting to play. Because I have heard, and I don't remember where, it's maybe old school thinking of like If a student is like their physical is a certain way, then they can't play an instrument. And it's interesting, like I have a violin book from Mr. Leopold Auer. He was a very stern man. He was a very virtuosic violin player, violin teacher in the late 1840s. And he just said if the fingers were too small, he would turn them down. If the fingers were too long, if the person was of large stature or small stature, then he would turn them down, saying, "You'll never be a violinist." So it's nice to hear, like, don't let the physicality of the student. And I guess the same is true for the way, because I'm still new to the band instruments, woodwind instruments. Is there has there been any examples or instances where a student wanted to play a certain instrument and just the physicality of like the way that they produce the sound, I guess the buzzing sound with their lips, um, deterred them from doing that? I don't know if you've ever come across that.
So Dr. HD can probably speak much more directly to this, given her research. I just
Oh, sorry.
personally, I would say it's
Huh?
our job to meet students where they are. And that whole manner of thinking, the weeding out. Okay. First of all, I just don't think that has a place anymore. We have moral and also a legal responsibility to teach the students in front of us and to meet them where they are and to give them what they need. And thankfully, we live in a society that hopefully is becoming more cognizant of that every day. I think a lot of that old thinking was much more based on the ego of the teacher, right? Now, okay, somebody wants to do this professionally, maybe there's a different set of considerations that we have. But I think if somebody's coming to you as an elementary or middle school student and just wants to experience this world, um, I've got lots of thoughts on the deleterious effects of competition in music. If anybody wants to go down that rabbit hole, there is an excellent new book by Sean Powell, a friend of mine who's a music ed prophet at North Texas, on how on a research-based book on how he thinks this entire idea of competition and weeding out has done great harm to music education. But anyway, but I am sure there are plenty of examples of people imposing difficulties on children. But Dr. HD, what have you found in your research?
Actually, I'm going to speak, if you don't mind, to my experience as a band director. There were times where I would dissuade or discourage someone from playing a particular instrument, but not dismiss them entirely. For instance, I was always taught that, if you have a Cupid's bow, you shouldn't play flute. But I noticed that Cupid's bows make great trumpet players. So if I saw a student with a Cupid's bow, I'd say, well, maybe flute's not the best choice, but trumpet might be really good for you. And I find it a lot with you mentioned brass buzz. So yeah, if your natural buzz is in the lower baritone range, I'm probably not going to put you on trumpet or horn because you're going to have to work really hard to contort your face to get up there. But you can play, trombone or baritone or maybe even tuba, depending on how low that buzz is. So again, I would say from my professional experience, you wouldn't use it as a reason to get them out, but just to refine their search to an instrument that they're maybe more physically set up to play. And I used to tell my kids it's like playing, when you play basketball, if you're 5'2", they're not going to make you the center. And it's not because they don't think you can play basketball. It's just that 5'2" is not conducive to playing center.
And a good example, Elise, she had a student who was gung-ho and was working and just was playing trumpet and was having a really hard time with upper partials, just really, really hard. And she's getting really frustrated. So Elise said, well, why don't we try baritone with you? Just, did tenor clef baritone so the student wouldn't have to immediately learn new fingerings, and immediately was getting a beautiful sound on it, was able to reach the upper partials on baritone, getting a beautiful lower range sound, and the student's now happy as a clam. So yeah, we always we always want to walk the fine line between presupposing and also making sure that we're doing the best job guiding students. Because I will say, within reason, the will to do something can overcome a lot of things. But if you, through your own professional experience, notice, this is along the same lines of what you want to do, you may just have even more success with this. We know that success breeds success and confidence in a student, which is going to lead to good things. So it's always keeping both of those things parallel in mind, I would say. And Dr. Holmes Davis had a lot more public school teaching experience than me. I am a lowly saxophonist and
I
trumpet.
am
So
ashamed. Yeah, I'm ashamed now because if they can't do it, then the logical conclusion is that I can't do it in my disabled state. But I have, deterred people from playing the flute because they had a Cupid's bow, and I have, looked at those kinds of characteristics. And I think I would do it differently now because, like I said, if they can't overcome those challenges, then I don't have a chance.
well,
But
and something else to keep in mind, it's a really good way of guiding the student if they have a couple instruments that they would love to play too. Um, because I would say on flute, if they are like, I love the flute, I want to play the flute, Cupid's bow shouldn't be a deterrent. But if they're like, I would love to play either the flute or the trumpet, and you see that's like, okay, I think you would be most successful on trumpet. That's a great way of guiding a student. So, um, anyway, great question. Well, let's talk about clarinet for a few minutes. So, clarinet. Oh boy, I put this read on a few minutes ago. Sorry. So clarinet obviously poses a few other potential challenges to think about. We have this maze of buttons and these open holes. Now, the open holes acoustically lend a lot to the characteristic of the clarinet sound. We have this lovely velvety, chocolatey, rich sound that comes off the clarinet. That would be very different if we had key cups covering instead of our fingers, right? But this also poses some challenges, especially for young students. How many of you guys have heard or something like that in your lives? Probably all of us, right? It is so easy for a young student to not cover these holes all the way, or to bump something, or to just get because again, third fingers usually are small and they're not able to cover the holes entirely. Now, there are adaptive workarounds to this. Have any of you ever heard of Mateo system clarinets? And Dr. HD, I don't know if you know this, we've actually got one.
I've never heard of it.
So, okay, when you get back, let me know. If you've never heard of this, you're going to freak out about it a little bit. They're really cool. So these were weirdly experimental clarinets that Selmer made both professional and student model versions. I think in the 80s at some point. You can get them cheap. If you have a student whose fingers are so small that they can't quite cover the tone holes, or if there's some other difference where they're having a hard time covering things, let me know. We can hunt for one of these things and make lives easier. I think there are also options where you can actually cover up some of these. People are trying to find ways of making this much more adaptive to students now. But again, probably the biggest barrier to this would be the one big issue to watch out for with either one of the single reeds is if students have an extreme underbite. That's not incredibly common these days because most of the time that kind of thing gets caught by a dentist. But of course, sometimes a family isn't able to fix things like that as quickly as maybe they'd like to. So if a student has an extreme underbite where the lower teeth project either equal to or past the upper teeth, it could potentially be really, really, really painful and potentially harmful long term for a student to form the embouchure clarinet or saxophone. That's going to be a very rare occasion that happens. It's just something to think about. Because if they're having to pull that jaw back, potentially they could get the socket out of whack. Again, how many times in your life are you going to have to deal with that? Virtually none. But the other thing to think about with clarinet is every once in a while you will have, again, if you're starting fourth grade, every once in a while you may have a student who is so small still that their fingers can't cover completely the keys. Um, so maybe there, again, if they've got a couple choices, even though it seems like it'd be very large, they'd probably be a better candidate for saxophone. And there's actually an adaptive thing for saxophone that I need to remember to tell you guys when we get there for very small hands. Anyway, so who
Before
else
you
should play the
steal
clarinet?
my before you steal my clarinet players, they make closed hole clarinets. Don't get ahead of yourself.
Well, and that's a beautiful thing about the Maceo clarinets. They are readily accessible. If you can find them, they're going to be pretty cheap closed hole clarinets. So and those will be wonderfully adaptive with very small hands, and they're really nice instruments too. And if students go back to standard clarinets, eventually there's no real difference in transfer. It's not like they're dealing with different fingerings or anything. Um, yeah, we got to look at that thing. I don't know when or who would have bought that, but it's a really cool instrument. Preston got put on it, and unfortunately needs just a little bit of work. But he did great on it in Woodwind Tech. Anyway, so um, equipment for clarinet. One thing that I should mention that I forget to tell people when I'm doing this kind of clinic is I still play on cane reeds, but I'm also a huge advocate of very high quality synthetic reeds. I think the main companies that are manufacturing those now are producing products that are absolutely on par with great cane reeds. Um, Legere is my favorite, but Diodario has recently come out with a synthetic reed called the Ven, and this perhaps is privileged information, but Van Doren is in the trial stages on their own synthetic reeds right now. So I think those will be really good options for students in the near term that don't change with weather. They're just as delicate in the tips, but otherwise, they're a really good option for beginners. You can get two, three, just take care of them, and they're going to last several months at a time. You're not going to, well, you're still going to run into the same problems, but otherwise. Mouthpieces are something that you should probably spend some time thinking about for your beginning clarinetists. Most of the mouthpieces contained in beginner clarinets and beginner saxophones, especially rental instruments, are of quite low quality, and they'll really affect the overall ability of your students to build really good habits in their embouchure and build good tonal concepts. So I'm not saying you need to go out and buy expensive mouthpieces. If that's something that your district prioritizes. Also, I don't know if you guys saw this year that state I think it was a fine arts consumables grant of up to a couple $1,000s. That's the perfect kind of thing to buy some mouthpieces and reeds and ligatures for your students. But anyway, but if you can invest the money in buying a Yamaha 4C for each one of your clarinets, they're about $20. That's one of those things usually if you've got a good relationship with your local music shop that does rentals, they can just throw that in. It's not going to be any more expensive to them than one of those lower quality mouthpieces. The 4C is still a plastic mouthpiece, so if a kid drops on the ground, as much as any mouthpiece, hopefully it won't shatter the way a high quality hard rubber one would, but they're going to have a much better chance of forming good habits and making a good sound from the beginning. So, ligatures, as long as it's in the round and it holds the reed on, it's fine. I'm a big advocate on clarinet of saxophone for beginners of the Rovner dark ligature. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this. I actually don't have one in my office at the moment, but they're the black cloth ligatures with the one screw on top. I think they're great for students. They're not expensive. I think they're still under $20 basically, which may seem expensive until you think about how often have you guys seen a smashed ligature on your floor? And a cloth ligature, the only thing that possibly could be smashed is the screw, and you'd have to drive a tractor over the thing to smash that screw. So maybe not the best professional ligature on earth for really in the weeds reasons I won't get into. But if you can ever buy a set of those for your kids, you're never going to deal with a broken ligature again. And they're gonna be good quality ligatures that stand up long term that you can keep across many years. Basically, if a kid loses one, that's the only way you're going to have to replace one. So, clarinets, I'll go ahead and say I'm a Conn Selmer artist clinician. I play some repair saxophones, but I'm also going to be the first to tell you if you can afford it, just buy Yamahas. Yamaha, I still think in my mind, makes some of the finest quality beginning wind instruments on earth. Unfortunately, they are getting expensive these days. Conn still makes really good beginning clarinets. They're bringing back the LeBlanc brand. It's mainly kind of their step up brand right now, which I have problems with because I think that's just a marketing ploy. I don't think there's any actual use for step up instruments unless a kid wants to play long term, but doesn't want to major in college or anything. Then they're good. They're good buys. Anyway, so let's talk about embouchure just a little bit. Now, just like flute, I think it's important to spend some time on shorthorn on clarinet so you can not deal with the forest of keys that you have on the instrument, but you can just spend some time getting used to the basics. You can play little tunes, you can introduce the concepts of articulation, you can do all kinds of things just with this. I'll even show you how they can play tunes, so you'll keep them interested in and their parents won't be like, "We spent all the money, you're only playing the barrel and the mouthpiece. What's going on?" I'm originally from Tennessee, by the way, so if I ever make that accent, that's where that's coming from. Anyway, so on clarinet, you'll want to park your top teeth on top of the mouthpiece. Now, this is going to be something that you're probably going to have to police with kids a lot. It is very common for kids to not like the way that the vibrations feel in their top teeth. It may make them uncomfortable. So you'll have a lot of kids who unknowingly will pull their top lip over their top teeth. We call that a double lip embouchure. It's not going to sound good in the long run. And also potentially the skin down here, it's quite a bit tougher than the skin up here. If somebody exerts pressure from their top teeth into the inside of their top lip, it's actually a lot easier to cause long-term nerve damage. So it's something you want to avoid. How do you avoid it if it's something that makes a kid uncomfortable? Well, if you can see my really gross example here, but I have a mouthpiece patch on top of this mouthpiece. This one is a piece of just rubber with some adhesive on the back. Van Doren makes them, D'Addario makes them, a bunch of other companies make them, and they'll usually sell them in sheets of 6 to 10 for just a few bucks, really. So I would just buy a ton of those, have them in my drawer. Every time you have, in the fall when you have your new kids, or anytime anybody gets a new mouthpiece, slap that right on top. Especially with school mouthpieces, it's going to protect them from getting the little teeth notches in the top. And kids, if there's any sensitivity in those top teeth, it's going to really reduce that. And then it gives them a nice stable platform to pop those top teeth. So, top teeth plant on top of the mouthpiece. Then a lot of people say you curl the lower lip over the lower teeth. That's you have an on-the-road emergency fix if when those fall. Yeah. Now, the good thing about it is the good ones that I would recommend either from D'Addario or Van Doren, they last a long time. Now you've got to clean the surface. Take a little bit of Windex or ammonia and a paper towel and just clean, clean, clean. Don't use hot water on a mouthpiece ever if it's a rubber mouthpiece because it will melt. And then stick the new one on. And that's really going to prevent those from slipping off. Worst case scenario, if you've got one in an emergency, number one, they're easy to carry around. And if you got like the little emergency kit, if you're going to LGPE, or if you're going to a marching contest or something, just throw those in there because you can slap a new one on. That's as easy as carrying around electrical tape, which would be the next best option. But electrical tape gets really, really nasty on here. I just say carry around a pack of them with some extra reeds and other stuff that you might have. Cool. So a lot of people say curl the lower lip over the lower teeth. I have actually really gotten away from that because I'm somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about the nuts and bolts of this stuff, and that's not actually what we're doing. In a perfect world, especially with professionals and really developed musculature and embouchures, the jaw and the teeth don't support the embouchure. The muscles around your lips are the things that support the embouchure themselves. The lower lip should be self-supporting. All the muscles underneath your lip are what's actually holding it up. And for both clarinet and saxophone, my teeth are a good 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch below my lip. So you may want to think about your lower lip being a little curled over, it's resting near the teeth, something like that. Just you don't want to say pull that lower lip over the teeth, because then what's going to happen? Kid's going to get the jaw involved against this poor little defenseless reed, close the reed off, and you're done for, right? So just say, rest the lower lip over the teeth. Don't pull it over. Don't anything like that. So top teeth go on top. Lower lip goes on the reed, the cushiest dry part of the lower lip. And then you're just going to firm up the corners where they are. And maybe think about pulling that jaw down just a little bit to open up some space. Some people say pull the corners back. I'm not a big advocate of that personally. I used to think about that because clarinet's my secondary. I did not start in clarinet. We'll talk about that more later. I'm a saxophonist first and foremost, who plays clarinet and flute. You really don't want the tension of pulling back. You don't want to smile, which is what that turns into with a lot of kids. If you firm those, yeah, drawstrings, a great way of thinking about this. You just think about pulling the corners straight back a little bit, and it firms that musculature right around the mouthpiece, and that's what we're wanting on clarinet. So, cool. And always, this is true with all wind instruments, you want space between those back teeth. You can walk in, you can hear young brass players that really tight sound. Oh, you need to open up your back teeth. If you're hearing a lot of tension and a lot of resistance in a woodwind sound, even if it's flute, it's a good indicator that just relax that, open up a little bit more space between those back teeth. So, some visualization stuff on clarinet. A lot of kids will think about just blowing straight through the instrument. And that's actually something I do think about on saxophone. I think about blowing all the way through the bell for any note that I have. But there are two different ways that I like to think about this on clarinet. If we think too much about blowing straight down through the body of the instrument, sometimes it can lead to really relaxing a lot of things and turning into a little bit of a flaccid kind of centerless sound. So I like to think about having the kids blow over the top of the mouthpiece. That tends to keep tension down while keeping support up, keeps the airspeed up. Or for more advanced players, especially those who are trying to ascend into the higher registers, sometimes it's really useful to think about them blowing up through the top of their head. If you're doing this with an 8th grader, 9th grader, you can still say something like, imagine your dolphin. Blowhole right up to the top of your head. Again, you gotta be careful with that kind of thing, but very useful when they start playing all over the register of the clarinet. They keep that same consistency of airflow, especially through leaping. That can be a conception that really, really helps. Keeps the jaw out of things, keeps air pressure up, and keeps tension down. So it's just another way of thinking about it. Now, articulation on clarinet. You notice I said on flute, we're thinking ta. That is the only woodwind that I would tell you to think ta. If we think ta on clarinet, we have real problems. Who's heard that before? I've heard that before. If you use ta, you're going to end up with way too much tongue on way too much reed. You're going to end up with an accidental slap tongue. So instead, I like a de, D-E-H, or te, T-E-H, de, for more legato articulations, te, for more staccato, more separate articulations. I almost said shorter. Oh no, don't say shorter. Shorter's bad. Shorter's not what we want. You get a much more consistent articulation, and you get nice separation without getting noise, without getting sound in the articulation. Cool. Consulting my notes here to make sure. Oh, okay. I'm going to go out of order and cycle back on something. I mentioned synthetic reeds. I didn't mention something else that I usually get questions about, and that's reed strength. So something important to keep in mind is you do not eternally go up in strength as you get better. Okay, that's not the way this works. Right now, I am playing on a very open mouthpiece with a Van Doren V21 Strength 3 reed. That is what I play on when I'm playing clarinet. It is the easiest transfer for me between my saxophone setup and this, and it works great. Um, what I would really advocate is, and some of you may disagree with this, and that's fine. This is just where I've landed after many years. I think you need to start kids on a quite weak reed. I would say start them on a two, Rico or Yellow Box or Van Doren Juno if they're available and they're cheap. You need something that is going to be that they're not fighting. Um, they need to be able to build up this muscle structure before moving on to a stronger reed, because I'll tell you, one of the reasons I'm coughing so much right now. I always fight this thing this time of year. You go from winter to summer and the humidity changes. And usually on saxophone, I end up changing my reed strength just a little bit. And I'm breaking in some Van Doren 3 V12s from my alto. And I'm still playing some of my 3.5 blue box Van Dorens. And there's a little bit too much resistance there as the humidity level's gone up and they've swollen up a little bit. And it's getting to my soft palate just a little bit because there's just a little too much force there. Now, I'm a professional who's done this for many, 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 many years. You don't want your kids to deal with stuff like that. Start them on something soft. After they're establishing really good practices, you're seeing a good, consistent embouchure that's not collapsed. Then move them to a 2.5. They can stay there for another year, 6 months, whatever. Same thing, all the good habits. Then maybe you're going to park them on a 3 for quite a while. Most clarinet mouthpieces, most kids, I really wouldn't go past 3.5. Some professionals are going to play on 4s, but usually that's with very particular mouthpieces that are very closed. So don't think your high school kids need to be playing on 4s. Almost none of them need to be playing on 4s, in my personal estimate. So, and if there is ever a saxophonist who comes up to me who's playing a 4 on alto or tenor, we're going to have words. If you go on my website right now, you will notice I play 4s on soprano. That is a very different thing, and we could have a conversation about that. I wouldn't advocate for a kid to play on that. Just again, if you look at my mouthpiece, it is very closed, which is the only reason I play on a strength like that. And I play 4s, and that's a whole nother thing too, because I play on a very, very closed bearing mouthpiece. But your kids, ultimately, almost all of them are going to be playing on 3s, on 3s to maybe 3.5s on clarinet, 3s on saxophone. Anyway, so having said that, continuing on. So tuning. This is an Alanism. Some old school folks like to say, in terms of tuning, we're going to lip down, right? You're going to use the embouchure to adjust. And in jazz, I would still say that's a perfectly acceptable way of adjusting intonation because it's part of performance practice in jazz that we can change the timbre quite a bit. And that's a desirable element. And that's good. In most concert playing, I would say I don't get my jaw involved at all, except for vibrato. Otherwise, my jaw is just a nice stable platform that doesn't adjust intonation. Now, why? It's like we were talking about with flute. There's only so far you can really adjust with the embouchure. You guys heard I was able to pull down with my embouchure a little bit, and then the sound goes away. I was able to pull up a little bit, and then it stops the reed from vibrating. So voicing, and I know I said I'm going to talk about with saxophone. I'm just going to talk about it right now. So what is voicing? Voicing is manipulating the interior of your oral cavity to change intonation and timbre. Now that sounds really complicated. It is not. If you or your kids can whistle, or if they can make a higher or lower hissing air sound, then you can do what you need to do to teach the concept of voicing. So I'm going to use the whistle as the illustrator, but again, same thing works perfectly well with a higher or lower air hissing sound. Whatever you're doing to get a higher whistle, whatever you're doing to get a lower whistle, the higher whistle motion works to adjust pitch up. The lower whistle motion works to adjust pitch down. I can do exactly the same motions while I'm playing and adjust pitch up a little bit and adjust pitch down a lot. Now, I didn't move my fingers. That was all through that whistle motion downward. And you notice I went up a little bit. I went down a lot. Woodwind intonation adjustment, that's par for the course. Generally speaking, you're going to be a little more pushed in general on all the woodwinds, so that most of the adjustments that you need to make, except for maybe a couple isolated pitches on the horn, are you're going to adjust down. So I know that was a 50-cent tour of that, but I promise you it is as simple as that. You're going to need to watch and make sure your kids don't move embouchures when you're introducing that concept, because they're going to feel like they need to do something else physical, because it doesn't feel like that should be enough to affect the kind of change that they want to affect. So that's the one thing to watch out for there. But again, voicing, you can change things wherever you need to and keep that tone and timbre consistent. In my mind, that is absolutely the superior way of adjusting intonation. You can just move things where you need to. So, cool. Now, vibrato. Most of the time, you're not going to have your clarinetist play with vibrato. It may be useful some advanced kids to know maybe a little bit about the concept, but I go carefully there. It's just not part of common performance practice when you're playing in concert band. And probably if a kid walked in and played, district band or all-state audition using vibrato, depending on who you had in the room, they may actually deduct points for that for a kid. So I would just kind of steer clear of that with your clarinetist generally. If they want to go study it in college or something and it's necessary in some French literature, great, they'll be introduced then. Otherwise, not something you really need to worry about. Now, again, with listening examples for clarinet, you always have to fight those gender norms, not norms, but gender stereotypes about the instrument. And again, there have been people from all backgrounds, people of all genders, who have been master clarinetists. So I've got a couple good examples for you here. One of my absolute favorite clarinetists of the moment is the wonderful Anthony McGill. He is principal clarinetist with the New York Philharmonic, one of the most glorious players of the instrument. And he just so happens to be an African-American man. And maybe if you've got some parents who are really reticent for their kids to play, I don't know, hopefully a video of his incredible performances and just the all-around excellent human being he appears to be could maybe move the needle on that a little bit. Beautiful player. He's doing the slow movement of the Mozart clarinet quintet with a great string quartet in that recording. Here's another one for you. Sabine Meyer, one of the great European clarinetists. She just plays with a lovely sound, and she's a great all-around musician. So I always like to share that recording too. There'll be a larger listening list for you guys when you get the handout. Those are just some.
I'm also pulling these off the chat into a document so I can share this separately if you want it.
And I've got this in a Word, so I'll send you the original Word document, so you don't have to do that. So, what questions do y'all have about clarinet in particular at the moment? Yes.
It was more about the interesting comment about vibrato,
Mhm.
because I know that's very common for like the orchestras. We want that vibrato tone. Is vibrato in for instruments like in the band woodwinds? Is that more of like the physicality, and the student maybe is not physically mature, or the mechanism isn't there physically for them to do it before college?
No, it's a really interesting, just kind of acculturated thing. One thing that I'm going to step back and actually talk about on flute is vibrato, because that left my mind for a moment. Because with all of the other woodwinds, vibrato is considered to be an integral part of the sound. Generally speaking, on flute and saxophone and oboe and bassoon, you can play with a straight tone, but normally when you're playing in a solo setting, when you're playing a solo in an ensemble, you're going to use vibrato on those instruments. Clarinet in the American tradition, for some reason, is the one woodwind traditionally that's played with straight tone. Now, that's not universal. The French clarinet tradition, they play with some vibrato, and there are some great American soloists who play with vibrato. Oh, why am I blanking on his name? Anyway, um, so the clarinet is the weird little outlier there. Just straight tone in the American tradition has largely been what's accepted.
Clarinet players would say somebody has to actually be in tune. But I actually do use vibrato in the altissimo, even though I was very firmly taught in the no vibrato school. You have to use it in the altissimo because you're not in tune there anyway.
Well, and it's funny too because in the band tradition, it's kind of a hard line, but I mean, in solo tradition in America, it really is kind of split down the middle because the Bonnard tradition, Daniel Bonnard, one of the great clarinet teachers, he was a French lineage clarinetist. He taught vibrato, and a lot of his students play with vibrato. Um, I'm not, yeah, I think it's because that in those early symphonic bands, you had so many clarinetists. If you're looking at like the University of Illinois band from 1952 or something, they could have 40 clarinetists in a band of 120 people very easily. And I think just that aesthetic developed because it would have been so hard to balance that ensemble and balance intonation if vibrato had been standard. Whereas saxophones, okay, you had 4 to 6 saxophones in that ensemble of 120. That was much less of a concern. Now you also had 15 flutes in that ensemble, and they were playing with vibrato. Speaking of which, let me go back for a second. So something that's kind of weird about the woodwinds. There are a lot of commonalities. Fingering systems are actually quite similar. Um, Articulation is different, as we've talked about, and vibrato is quite different, as we've talked about. So you're going to notice when we talk about saxophone in a few minutes, this is going to be a very different vibrato that I'm talking about when I'm talking about vibrato. But there are two kind of main schools of thought that people use with vibrato these days for the different woodwinds. There's an airstream vibrato and there's a jaw vibrato. So the airstream vibrato, you're actually using your abdominal muscles to pulse the air a little bit. So if you guys say ho 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 ho, or if you say ha 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 ha, either one of those things, you're going to notice that little bounce in your abs and that little pulse in your airstream. So for flute, you're going to use that air pulse vibrato. So you're going to blow a straight stream of air. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to hear this or not via WebEx. Now mine's a little herky jerky because I trained myself never to use that vibrato except when the few times a year I play flute. But it's just that little gentle undulation in the pitch that you get from that difference of intensity of that little bit of ho 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 ha 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 in the airstream. So that's an integral part of the flute sound. Generally speaking, most professional flutists and vibrato is an expressive tool when you get to an advanced level of usage. So absolutely, it's going to speed up. It's going to slow down. You're not going to use it on certain pitches. You're going to use it on certain pitches. But generally speaking, when you introduce it to kids, it's going to be a relatively constant on top of the sound. So anyway, air stream vibrato, and you guys will get the handout that'll have more info on that. Well, moving along here, saxophone. So you guys are going to get the handout, and the saxophone section is considerably larger than the other sections. I will go ahead and say I dumped. I was assembling this handout, and I just dumped my usual saxophone clinic handout straight into it because I said, okay, if it's a little overkill on that information, so what? Obviously, I have a lot of opinions about saxophone, more than any of these other instruments, because this is the one that I spend the most time with every day of my life. But saxophone, again, is for everybody. I have one caveat to that. If kids have other instruments that they would love to play, steer them towards that. Because most of the pedagogical problems that people say are problems on saxophone systemically just arise from having too many saxophones in an ensemble. Saxophones are too loud. Okay, anything's too loud when you got 17 of them, right? So I'm going to add a caveat to my caveat. Now, if a kid really wants to play saxophone, just let him play saxophone. Because what's more important, a balanced middle school concert band or lifelong musical enjoyment with something that's going to bring people a lot of joy and peace in their lives? Okay, I put it like that. I think we all know the answer, right? Um, and I would say too, especially with both clarinets, well, especially with flutes and saxophones, your beginning band should not be balanced. It should not sound balanced. If it sounds balanced, you're going to have tonal problems later on down the road because your flutes are probably overplaying and your saxophones are probably using almost no air or they're biting. Same thing with your brass. They're probably not using enough air if everybody's balanced. 3 months into beginning band. Just a thought. Just a thought. So if you can steer kids to other instruments they're also equally interested in playing, great. You're going to cut down on some of those problems in tonal development on saxophones. Otherwise, saxophone's for everybody, right? It's a wonderfully adaptive instrument in my personal estimation. It has covered keys. And actually, if you have students with very small hands that have problems bumping these palm keys, there's actually now a solution to that. Rulon Brown, who I do work with, I am an endorsing artist for his company, Key Leaves Incorporated. So I will say that. But Rulon is a saxophonist and saxophone teacher as well as a company owner out in Washington State. And he's through the years developed a bunch of things for saxophone care products. But he's has a young daughter who's was a beginner not that long ago who loves playing saxophone, and he started to run into all kinds of things that he thought were issues with a very young girl playing saxophone. And one of them was when you have very small hands, you start opening up these palm keys. So he actually has a product now where you can get your local shop to just take the keys off real quick. He actually has instructions for how to do that safely on a beginning horn and the self-adhesive stoppers that go over the tone holes on those that they'll just pull off easily within a year. You don't really need any special tools, but they'll keep those holes closed. And it even comes with a little box where you put the parts that you just took off with like little spots for the screws, and it even like makes you set a reminder on an app. They'll remind you where you put the thing. Anyway, but it's a wonderfully adaptive instrument in my personal estimation, and I think everybody should be able to play. So, equipment. We know this is true of all wind instruments at this point, that there is money to be made in making counterfeit instruments and bad instruments and marketing them all over the internet, and parents will fall prey to that. Sometimes it may feel like you're fighting a losing battle trying to keep up with that. And you may be of the opinion that you would rather have a kid have an instrument in their hands than not, and I completely understand that. Just you want to do some education on that because what you don't want is a kid gets a brand new red, blue, whatever colored instrument, and they're so excited about it, and then it breaks, and you have to have the conversation with the parent that this is not fixable. They have just wasted their money. And of course, that's a hard conversation to have. So do your best. Do your best on that. What I would counsel you, if you guys like going to yard sales or if you like going to estate sales and that kind of thing, get into a habit where you just kind of make the rounds on a Saturday. And if you ever run into any Yamaha YAS 23s, just buy them because you're probably going to get a pretty good deal on an old one. I'll hook you up with my saxophone repair tech in Atlanta who will fix them up for you for not much money at all. And then you've got a bunch of really, really high quality instruments that kids can play. Because like I said before, unfortunately, Yamaha knows how good their beginner horns are, and the new ones are getting not terribly cost effective. A brand new YAS 23, I think, is almost $1,600 now. Right? Well, it's not 23 anymore. It's a YAS 26. They changed the model number. But $1,600 for a beginner saxophone is insane to me. And I think because of inflation, we're probably going to get a point where some of these things are $2,000, and that's crazy. I think used good quality Yamahas and to a certain extent Summer USA's are a sweet spot right now. Eastman, I wouldn't advise their higher level saxophones, but I think they're doing a good job with beginner saxophones right now. So that's a really good, still relatively cost effective beginner instrument. But just go carefully. And if you guys ever see anything that you're like, hey, what is this? Just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to say, yeah, get that. That's a great deal. Or it's too much money, or yeah, stay away from that. Um,
Andrew, I would caution against the older Yamaha clarinets.
gotcha,
Yamaha's making great clarinets now, but their clarinets used to be very, very, very stuffy.
gotcha. Um, Something else to be on the lookout for saxophones. If you guys find old Vitos, um, that was uh, that was a beginner brand manufactured by LeBlanc. LeBlanc, of course, used to be its own company. They got bought out by Conselmer, then bulldozed for about 20 years, and now they're bringing the brand back. But Vitos are very good instruments. And usually they weren't actually American made. Most of the Vitos are actually Yamaha YAS 23s. My first saxophone is a Vito that is a YAS 23. It's a beautiful instrument. And some of the others were manufactured by Yanagisawa, which principally just makes professional level horns. They're the Vitos that they made are some of the only beginner horns they ever made, and they're incredible instruments. So again, if you find an older horn, let me know. Bundy 2, stay away from that. It's tank, and it is probably the poorest playing mass marketed saxophone by a major company that has ever been made. So, um, like I said, just shoot me an email if you're ever in doubt about anything. Um, how did I do that? How did I just raise my own hand? I'm like George Jetson over here. Anyway, so probably the most important piece of equipment for any beginner is going to be having a high quality mouthpiece and reed combination. So, like I said, you want to start just like on clarinet. You want to start your saxophonist on a strength two, probably Rico for a little bit, just because until they get really used to it, they're going to go through some. So it's okay to have a less expensive reed, right? And then once they get used to it and they're not going to tear them up, move them to a strength two Van Doren or D'Addario. Again, I'm a Van Doren performing artist, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, but I'm not a shill, I promise. But Van Doren and D'Addario are the two main players in high quality reeds at this point. There really isn't a third, in my personal opinion. But get them on a two, then a 2.5, and then eventually they're probably going to park it long term at a three. Most student saxophonists, all the way up to college level, are probably going to be just fine on a three with most good mouthpieces. Again, a really good, inexpensive mouthpiece for a beginner is a Yamaha 4C. It's plastic, just like the clarinet mouthpiece that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Costs $25, and you've got something that's going to work. That again, they're going to be able to develop good tonal habits on and good embouchure concept on. So, um, posture is something to think about with saxophone. You'll see a lot of kids trying to support the saxophone various ways. And one question that I get a lot is, should kids be playing in the middle or to the side? And my answer is yes. Right. It is not very helpful, but it depends on the student. I would say most beginner saxophonists are going to start playing off to the side because with smaller saxophonists, that's usually going to be what's most comfortable. So they're going to adjust the neck strap so that the mouthpiece goes directly into their embouchure. They're going to adjust the neck. They're going to adjust their mouthpiece. So they're not reaching over. They're not straining. They're not playing off to the side. They're not doing anything weird. The weight is supported by the neck strap, and the saxophone is going to rest on your right side. You know, you're not pushing and pulling. Saxophone's coming straight to you. Now, some players, when they get a little taller, I prefer to play in the middle on alto. Obviously, tenor, I'm still playing off to the side. Barry, I'm still playing off to the side. But if that's the most comfortable thing, and if hand position looks comfortable. So wrist is a straight line. When I'm playing, of course my G sharp's sticking. Basically, this same hand position is going to be retained when I'm playing when I'm sitting. You don't want the broken wrist, their hands looking like this. You don't want them looking like this. You don't want them in an awkward position, right? So just kind of go down the line with all of your woodwinds and just make sure the hands look relatively comfortable. It's going to be awkward when they start because they've never done this before, but eventually you're trying to get them to as natural of a process as possible, right? When I'm playing, my hands look like this because this is the way that your hand looks when it's relaxed, right? Curved fingers, all the motion is coming from the big knuckle. There's no small, weird motions because that is inefficient and hurts eventually. Also, I don't support the weight of the saxophone. I don't play. Anyway, I don't play holding the saxophone out most of the time unless I'm playing a wedding gig and I want to look really cool for a minute. No. Um, that weight on the thumb is just going to create a bunch of tension here, and actually it changes the relationship with the embouchure and ends up making the sound really bright and uncontrolled eventually. So anyway, something to think about. All the way to the neck strap should, all the way to the horn should be supported by the neck strap. And I don't know why this is, but I run into so many. Just realized I unplugged my computer, so fix that real quick. I don't know why this is, but I run into so many beginners who have these terrible neck straps in their cases, like of the cheapest quality, and usually a completely wrong length for the instrument. So they've got these neck straps pulled all the way up, and the altos come in like here on them. What good is that? So what I would say to your instrument people is, give me a decent neck strap. Don't give me crap. Give me something that's actually going to adjust up where the kid doesn't have to hold it and lift it up with their hands. So anyway, embouchure. Now, embouchure is a little bit different than on clarinet, and this is actually quite important because if I play with the clarinet embouchure on saxophone, it's not going to sound good. Uh, the clarinet embouchure makes a lot of sense for a narrow reed. You need support, you need that structure to get that reed to vibrate efficiently, right? Saxophone has a much wider and really thinner reed. It takes less effort to get the saxophone reed, even of an equal strength, to vibrate. You need more cushion in the saxophone embouchure. So it starts out the same. You put your top teeth on top of the mouthpiece, and you relax the weight of the head. So you should feel the weight of your head pushing back against the neck strap. You should get all the weight of your head, those muscles relax, supported entirely on top of the mouthpiece. Bam, you'll feel it right back here. Same thing, I always play with the mouthpiece patch on top of my mouthpieces for stability, for comfort, and also to make sure I don't mess up my mouthpiece. So you relax your neck muscles. And then again, this is self-supporting. That cushiest dry part of my lower lip is a stable platform. It's going to kind of sort of come close to my teeth. I say something slightly different in the handout, but and here's the big difference. Instead of firming my corners or thinking about pulling them back slightly, I'm actually going to bring them in just as if I were saying ooh. So you guys see when I say ooh, all those muscle bands come forward. And you're also going to notice that that lower lip gets really puffed up and all the muscles start to bunch into it. So you get this really, really cushy platform for the breed. Now, you notice on clarinet too, I said, I want to think about pointing the chin a little bit. You don't think about that on saxophone. On saxophone, the chin should look basically the same as it does every day. So here's my chin. Here's my chin when I'm playing saxophone. Really no difference between the two. So anyway, good saxophone, I'm sure, hopefully. Saxophone articulation, it's the same as we were talking about on clarinet. You want to avoid ta. You noticed when I was playing clarinet with the ta articulation, I had a little pop in the sound. It's even more pronounced on saxophone. Here's a bad ta articulation. I get that percussive slap tone effect. Now, which sometimes I want to do. It's actually written for me in pieces, so I actually sometimes will use that ta articulation to get the effect that the composer wants. But most of the time, that's not what you want, right? So instead on saxophone, my go-to is a do or two, D-O-O or T-O-O articulation. Do for more legato articulations, two for more separated articulations. Here's do. Here's two. So you get the separation that you want or the legato articulation that you want without any additional noise. I think that works a lot better. It's also a lot easier to get sped up. And I will reiterate this. Every articulation, except for the most extreme marcatos in jazz, you are going to make sure that your air remains solid underneath the articulation. You're not going to start and stop the air itself. You're just going to use that tongue as a valve to allow the reed to vibrate or to stop the reed from vibrating. Now, vibrato on saxophone. So when we were talking flute a few minutes ago, I was talking about the air pulse vibrato. Now, it works beautifully on flute, but if you do that on saxophone, it's going to sound like a nightmare. It doesn't sound good. It sounds real bad. It sounds real bad. It just sounds really over the top on saxophone. So we don't use air pulse vibrato on saxophone. We use a jaw vibrato. So you notice when I was talking about clarinet, I said we don't want to move the jaw around for intonation. I'm only going to use it for vibrato if I'm using vibrato on clarinet. So the embouchure's firmly secured. And you're just going to do a little gentle chewing motion in the lower jaw. I like to say va 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 va. You can do it with middle school kids. Okay, remember when you were like 7 or 8 and you're playing with your Matchbox cars? Va 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 va. Have them do it in eights. Va 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 va. But it's that forward va 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 up and down chewing motion. Very, very slight, and very, very gentle, right? Because if you chew up into the reed, you're just going to stop the reed. But just a really gentle there and back. You're not pushing and pulling because that's not what the jaw's supposed to do. Just that natural up and down va 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 chew. Once they get really used to that and you're doing an eighth notes with them, va 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 va, then you have them try to do the same thing on the horn and really moving pitch up and down. Sorry. It's allergies too. So va 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 va. To initially get the concept down, you may just have them do something really extreme. See if they can go as far as they can before the tone breaks. Now, obviously, I'm never going to play that like that, right? But if I get the extremes of the motion down, then it's really easy to start to refine that. You put it on the Met. I got a whole video on this. If you guys want it, I'll just send it to you. Van Doren did it with me a couple of years ago. That should be in the handout, but if it's not, I'll shoot it your way. Now, one sec. Sorry. Sure, I'm not totally forgetting things. Oh, and tuning. Yeah. So again, that voicing concept, that higher lower whistle makes all the difference on saxophone. If I'm moving my embouchure around for intonation adjustment purposes on saxophone, I'm going to end up with big problems. Tone's just going to break before I get where I need to be in terms of intonation adjustment. But if I'm using that higher lower whistle concept, again, I'm not adjusting my fingers at all. That was all through voicing. You're going to be able to take pitch wherever you need it. Cool. Okay. So I need to start closing this up in about 10 minutes because I am going to go to Allison Ryder's senior recital down the hall from my office. We can talk about double reads a little bit. We can take questions about anything you guys are thinking about. How would you like to proceed with this? Oh, last 10 minutes. And I will say, while you're conceptualizing questions, I'm going to send this to you later through Dr. HD, this document. But I just wanted to draw a couple great examples of saxophonists in the chart here. So that first one is the great Otis Murphy, who is actually a native of Milledgeville, Georgia. His first saxophone teacher was my great predecessor here, Jim Willoughby. But Dr. Murphy is now the professor of saxophone at Indiana University Jacobs School of Music, one of the great saxophone pedagogues of the world. And he is just a marvelously nice human being, too. And his mom and dad were both employees of Baldwin County Schools, and his dad was also a night watchman at Georgia College. And here is another example. The H2 Quartet, one of the finest saxophone quartets in the world. I'm very honored to call them my friends. They're excellent people. Two of them are school of music administrators now at Virginia Tech and the University of Oklahoma. One of them is the Barry Player, is president of the North American Saxophone Alliance, and she's a music theory prof at Virginia Tech. And forget, I think Jeff's playing alto in this. He's the saxophone professor at Florida State. Anyway, now that I've rambled for a moment, what questions do you all have? Well, I guess I'm going to talk about double reeds for a minute. Okay. So I have a hot take. How much time do we spend worrying about double reeds as teachers versus the amount of students who play double reeds? I have a real hot take. I don't think that many kids are going to continue to play double reeds in the future because it's kind of a weird timbre that I think kids today don't connect with entirely. Now, having said that, you are going to have some kids who that is their jam. And if a kid learns what an oboe or bassoon is and says, I want to play that, then the wand has found the wizard, and you need to help accommodate that. So these are instruments that if somebody's going to play them, the school absolutely needs to own them. Even beginner bassoons are insanely prohibitively expensive. So this is one of those things, if you think kids want to play them and if you want them in your ensembles, then there needs to be an investment by the band program or by the school to make sure that those instruments are available for students. Oboes, in my mind, are some of the weirdest instruments that are still manufactured because there's no real agreement in fingering systems between various manufacturers. If you've got a choice, I would say go with the Fox Company. They're an American-based manufacturer of double reeds. I think they make some of the highest quality double reeds for the school market. Really, Selmer USA and Van Doren have almost gotten out of the beginner oboe and bassoon market, just because I don't think it's terribly cost effective for them. Should you worry about making reeds? No. No middle school or high school kid should worry about making reeds. If somebody's studying with a private teacher and the teacher wants to get into that with them, great. You know what I know about making reeds? Zip, zilch. Never had to do it in my life. You won't either. I promise. Don't worry about it. I own many a reed knife to make sure that I can adjust my own reeds, and that's about as far as it goes. So don't worry about it. Now, in terms of articulation, you can think about the double reeds a lot like you do the other woodwinds. I would say think in terms oboe, articulation wise, you can think the same way you think about basically with clarinet. It's a de or te articulation. Bassoon, you can think the same way you do about saxophone. It's a do or to articulation. And to make it even weirder, vibrato is completely different between the two double reeds. You're thinking usually about an air pulse flute-like vibrato for oboe. You're thinking about a jaw saxophone-like vibrato for bassoon. Now, in terms of accessibility, really depends on the instrument. If you can find some of the older Selmer USA oboes, they may not be the highest quality oboes on earth, but they're pretty decent instruments. And they usually have really simplified fingering systems that make it a lot easier for small hands or for people who may have mobility differences. Bassoon, it's a very complicated, strange instrument. But if somebody's really into it and they really want to go for it, they do make small modified bassoons for younger players, for smaller players, instruments with minimized key work to make them much more approachable. Yes, Victoria.
It's interesting. My brother was actually a bassoon player in high school.
Nice.
My parents rented his instrument through the school, and any of the materials and everything, accessories that my brother needed would be through the school. And we were trying, I think from what I remember, they were trying to kind of continue that even after high school. But I think the cost at that time, because that was in the late 90s, the cost to continue with the bassoon, and they had looked into purchasing one and they just found it to be very, very expensive and a little bit challenging to find a bassoon teacher for my brother for him to continue. So unfortunately, he didn't continue the bassoon after high school, which I think we still ask him to this day. But it's just one of those things. I found just a wonderful instrument, and I don't know why. Maybe because of the cost, the bassoon players are not as common as, from my understanding. I don't know if it's because of the instrument itself, or because it's difficult, or because of the expensiveness of the instrument itself. But that was one of the factors, a lot of reasons why my brother chose to discontinue the bassoon, even though he loved it. He absolutely practiced all the time. Just couldn't, maybe all the technicalities couldn't continue after high school.
I'm still struck. And I even say this to my woodwind tech classes. I don't understand the technical progress of the oboe and bassoon, because the clarinet, saxophone, and flute all started out in very similar places. They had very similar fingering systems to oboe and bassoon, with differences, but cross fingerings and other kind of awkward aspects of the instruments that were gradually refined and changed. And largely oboe and bassoon didn't make the same changes. And there are oboes with automatic octave keys. So if you guys look at a saxophone, there's one octave key, but it operates multiple, two, or in the case of a Yamaha baritone saxophone, three different octave keys. That used to be two separate keys until the 19-teens that a saxophonist would have to operate. There are oboes that are manufactured with an automatic octave key. They're not terribly expensive. It's not an incredibly complicated mechanism, but most oboe players still buy instruments with manual octave keys, where they actually have to physically switch between three octave keys. It's the same with bassoon. There have been many attempts and successful attempts to improve the quality of the instrument to make it easier to manufacture that haven't stuck. And I think that's a real threat to the instrument's continued survival. Along with, again, those are very old timbres that some people love them, but I was thinking about this today. You think about pop music that's popular with kids, and you think about all those backing tracks to pop songs. You're not going to be dealing with many plangent timbres. There aren't a whole lot of sawtooth waves in electronic accompaniments. They're usually sine waves. They're usually things that are much more mellifluous without that little bit of plangency, that little bit of twist in the sound that we have with the double reeds. And I think that it's partially because human ears have changed a little bit. That's not something that's quite as accessible for us as it perhaps used to be to our ancestors. But again, that's just Kentucky windage. I have nothing to back that up. So. Well, what other questions do you all have at the moment? I will say, hopefully, you guys have had enough contact with me to know that if you ever have any questions about anything, just ever in the history of time that I am still living, just shoot me a message and let me know. And I am happy to help. If you got students that you got questions about, I'm happy to help. So just say the word, but I'll send along a handout, and I'll send along a sample listening list through Dr. HD, and she'll get that out to y'all. But I just appreciate your time today. I appreciate you listening to me go on and on about these woodwinds, and I hope that hopefully something useful happened here. But here in a second, I'm going to get down the road and hear this great vocal student that we're very proud of, that she's going to present recital here. So,
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Allen. This has been wonderful. I learn something new every time I talk to you.
Oh, jeez.
And
Well, I learn
yeah,
something new every time I talk to you, my friend.
Well, thank you so much, and enjoy your recital.
Well, thank you. Yeah, Allison. It's going to be a good one, I think. So,
I'm sure.
there's a
Yeah.
little line of kids that I've had contact with now all 4 years, because it's really that first group that I have. So, trying to go to as many as I can.
Nice. Yeah, I try to. It's just I'm not in any shape to do it right now.
Well, right, because you just got back from traveling for a whole week.
I did. Yeah, so have a good evening, and thank you, Victoria and Devin, for showing up and for being engaged in
so
our
much.
presentation.
Thank you.
Appreciate y'all. And Tina, I'll email you those two right now so you can get them out to them whenever.
Thank you. I will send them out to now.
I
Okay,
appreciate
have a
you.
good weekend.
Thank you
Have
so
a
much.
great afternoon. No, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.